So my name is Professor Christopher Yates. I'm an instructor of English literature and writing at Providence College, and I've also taught at the past at Brown University, which is also where I received my PhD in English literature. I've taught Animal Farm actually in the classroom, both at Brown and at Providence College, because I teach there a course on satire. And so this is one of my favorite texts to handle in a classroom. And I'm really excited to be working with all of you on it. I don't read or speak Korean, unfortunately, but I have been following the band page. And I was really glad to see that there's so many people who are excited to read more, to learn more about Animal Farm, which is, I think, a really fun and interesting novel. As for today's agenda, we're going to be spending about 25 minutes talking about the book, talking about George Orwell, talking about the historical context of the book, talking about characters and stories. We're going to then spend about 15 minutes doing a reading sneak peek. And what I mean by that is, I know that we haven't all moved into reading the novel yet, but the reading sneak peek is going to just give us a couple little passages from the first few chapters that we can talk about, and that will hopefully get you excited to read a little bit more about it. And then in the third section, we're going to be looking at some guided reading questions. These guided reading questions, hopefully you guys will be able to respond to those on band, but I just wanted to sort of read the questions aloud and talk a little bit about these questions and why I think that they're going to be useful to you in guiding you as you read the first few chapters of the novel. And then after that will be some following up instructions, not by me, but by my colleague, and those will be in Korean. So with that said, let's now jump into the novel. Let's talk about Animal Farm itself. So Animal Farm is published in 1945, which is an important year that many of us might recognize because this is the very end of World War II. So Orwell was actually working on it before World War II even ended, and he published it just as this major historical event finishes. The author is, as we know, George Orwell. And the genre, well, there's actually a couple genres to this work. And I think that we're going to talk more about these genres next week and really define them. But for now, let's just say that the genres are satire, allegory, and animal fable. And again, I think we'll talk a little bit more about those next week, though if anyone has any specific questions, we'll also have time for that, I think, today. Some of the major themes that make people read this novel include mob rule, the distortion of reality, and also political corruption. So some pretty heavy themes. And one very famous line that is often referenced in English media and that most people think of when they think of this novel is this: all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Now, I know that that line might not make sense to us yet for those of us who haven't read the novel, but hopefully that will make sense pretty soon. I hope it makes you a little bit interested to know what that means. Some animals are more equal than others. To give you guys just a very general shape of the plot, I don't want to spoil the ending or any of the major plot points, but I just want to present to you guys the premise of the story so that we all have a sense of what we're going to be looking at next. So here's the general shape of the plot. The animals on an English farm work together, rebelling against their human farmer in order to create a society in which animals can be free from human tyranny. Though their revolution is successful, the animals soon find equally powerful enemies in their fellow animals. So again, this is just a relatively spoiler-free, broad outline of the plot. But I just wanted to give you all a sense of, what this novel is basically about in narrative terms. Next, I want to talk a little bit about George Orwell himself. I always think, and when I teach in a classroom at college, I always want to emphasize this, that you really have to know something about the author to understand his or her work. I think that knowing something about the author really just provides context for the novel. It lets you know what their motivations might be in writing a text, what historical events or pressures or conditions they are responding to in writing. Because, of course, all literature happens in history, right? Even if we read it decades or centuries later, it still in some way speaks to the moment and the culture in which it was written. So I think we really ought to know a little bit about George Orwell before we move further. One interesting thing to note off the bat is that George Orwell is not actually the author's legal name. George Orwell is his pen name. Sometimes this is also referred to with the French term a nom de plume, or again, a name of the pen in French. His actual name that he was born with was Eric Arthur Blair. So maybe you're wondering then, where did the name George Orwell come from? Why did he pick this name? Why did he write under a false name? The answer is that in his early writing career, he was engaged in all kinds of strange stunts and activities. For example, he wanted to write about the British prison system. And so he actually, on purpose, got himself arrested and spent a couple of nights in jail so that he could experience jail directly and then write about it more honestly and more accurately. And he didn't want to embarrass his family. Orwell was a member of a quite old, quite respectable English family, the Blair family. And he kind of knew that this sort of thing would be embarrassing to his parents, to his grandparents, to his cousins. So he decided he had to use an assumed name. Now, if you want to know where George Orwell comes from, it's actually a funny answer. He wanted a name that sounded very, very English, right? He's an English author from England. So George is actually the patron saint of England. Yeah, I see a comment there. He was a bit of an oddball. So again, George is the patron saint of England. And actually the flag of England, a white background with a red sort of plus sign on it, is the St. George's flag. So he's picked a very central figure in English culture. And then Orwell is actually from the River Orwell. So in the east of England is a river named the Orwell River that George Orwell really liked. He thought it was a really beautiful river. So he's picked this name that is just a very English name, the patron saint of England, and then a river running through England. It'd be interesting to think about what the Korean equivalent of this kind of name might be, right? A hyper-Korean name. He was actually born not in Britain, but in India in 1903. Now, his family was ethnically English, but his parents worked as part of the colonial administration in India at a period of time where Britain ruled India as a colony. Oh, I like that example name in the chat there. So again, his parents were part of the British colonial administration that was running India as a colony. So he actually spent the earliest years of his life, not in Britain, but in India. And he only went to England to receive his high school education. He attended Eton, which is a very famous school that some of you might know. To think for a moment about some of the major works by Orwell, one thing I want to note that is very interesting to me is that when we talk about the period following World War II, leading up to the fall of Soviet Russia, we refer to this period of time in English, maybe in other languages as well, as the Cold War. And this major historical term, Cold War, was actually invented by George Orwell in a very famous essay that was entitled, and it's a very shocking title, The Atomic Bomb and You. And his argument here is that once two major world powers, like the United States and Russia, both have atomic bombs, have nuclear potential, you can't anymore have traditional warfare. So his argument is that this sort of period of history where multiple different competing armies have nuclear capabilities would always be a Cold War, or as he also refers to it, an indefinite stalemate. A stalemate is when neither side of a battle can really move forward. And his argument is that things can't really move forward because to move forward would mean destruction for both parties. So he very accurately predicted before the Cold War really was in full swing, a period of time that lasted almost 40 years. So he really had a very good sense of what was coming in history. He wrote Animal Farm the text that we're looking at, between 1943 and 1945, at the end of World War II. And we'll talk a little bit more about that historical context later. He also, just a couple of years after that, in 1948, wrote his very famous novel, 1984. And as you can see, he inverts the year from which he wrote it to the year that it's set. So he writes in 48, he sets it in 84. Some of the major ideas, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Some of the major ideas which Orwell worked on as a writer include the idea or the theory of totalitarianism. So probably some of us are familiar with the idea of totalitarianism, but Orwell was one of the writers who really wanted to think about what this idea means, to expand upon it and sort of make this a full concept. Totalitarianism, as many of us probably know, is a state in which a government exerts a very, very high level of control over its population. In addition to that strong feeling of control, it also exerts power through very harsh crime and punishment. In a totalitarian government system, generally speaking, the people are subservient to the state. So Orwell was really interested in this idea. Now, one way in which he wanted to really think about the concept of totalitarianism was to also think deeply about the relationship between politics and language, and particularly the manipulation of language. So one major idea of Orwell's was that a totalitarian government doesn't just exert its power by physical force. Now, that's an important part of it. But his argument here was it's not just physical violence that a totalitarian government uses to control the population, but also language. It can do this by manipulating information, by controlling what information people have access to, by altering the past, by deciding what kind of language can be used. So one of Orwell's major innovations was to really argue that language through propaganda is also a major weapon used by a totalitarian government. So it's not just police and punishment and prison and military, but also information. So this is a pretty major idea of Orwell's that I think is now quite commonsensical to us. He was really a student of totalitarian governments, including Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, which were his two primary examples in his writing. To speak a little bit more now about his actual career, Orwell, early in his life, served as a member of the imperial police in Burma, which we now call in English Myanmar, under the British Crown, which contributed to his skepticism of imperialism. Maybe we'll talk more about this in future weeks, but as a member of the imperial police, he was responsible for essentially maintaining British power in British colonies such as Burma. And he was very, very unhappy in his time there. It really made him think about power because he was the person responsible, in fact, for exerting power in that situation. So it really made him sick, and it really made him skeptical of British imperialism. After he was done working as a member of the imperial police in Burma, he moved to England, where he worked as a school teacher. And he was essentially trying to buy himself time while he worked on his early writings and tried to get them published. To think now about his early writing career, before he ever worked on novels, he first worked as a journalist. So he was engaged in various kinds of journalism before he wrote fiction. Maybe that's why he has such a clear writing style relative to some other authors, because a journalist has to be very direct, very fact-oriented. In addition to working as a journalist, he also worked as a volunteer soldier in the Spanish Civil War, which influenced his political views. I think in future weeks, we'll talk more about his experiences in the Spanish Civil War, because they were very important in shaping his politics. His political writings and his journalism got him some recognition in England, but it was really his novels, including Animal Farm, that made him a household name. So Animal Farm really, we could say, put him on the map. I quite agree with that comment. He definitely had direct experience in some major political regimes. And I think that's why he's able to think so practically about politics in his novel. So that's a great observation. So I wanted to talk first a little bit about the historical context of the novel, just because I think, again, it's really important to our collective understanding of what Orwell's doing here, how he is responding to history. So over the course of the month, we're going to be considering these parallels between history, in particular, the history of Russia and the Russian Revolution, and Animal Farm. But first, let's just talk a little bit about some of that history before we get into all of the specifics. So here we have, I think you can all see a timeline. So all of these events in Russian history are going to be covered in some way by Orwell when he writes Animal Farm. So I know that we haven't all read everything in Animal Farm yet, or even really any of it, but you're going to be able to look forward to seeing these events represented symbolically in the plot of Animal Farm. So in 1859, for example, Karl Marx and Engels are going to publish the Communist Manifesto. This is, of course, as we all know, the sort of ideological origins for socialism and for communism. So it's a politically very, very influential book. We're going to see this represented right in the beginning of chapter 1 of Animal Farm, when Old Major, a very wise boar, lists the tenets of an ideology that the animals are going to call animalism. And we're going to see, I think, that animalism and communism actually share quite a number of key features. Second, we're going to see represented in Animal Farm the Russian Revolution, or in other words, the period in 1917 in which the Bolsheviks, these are the original communists in Russia, launched a revolution to overthrow the Romanov dynasty. We're going to see this represented in the text when the animals drive out Mr. Jones, the farmer, from the farm. This isn't a big spoiler, I don't think, because it occurs very early in the novel. So keep an eye out for it when you're reading the text. Third, between 1928 and 1940, the Soviets collectivized Russia's agricultural industry, creating state-controlled farms. Now, I don't want to spoil the text, so I'm not going to compare this to the plot just yet, but we will get there. But I just wanted to mention this because it's something to keep an eye out for. This is a period in Russian history when all of the private farms of Russia are taken over by the government. This is what we call collectivizing. In other words, this is when these are rendered part of the state. So it's the opposite of privatizing something. So this is a long drawn out process in Russian history, and various sorts of schemes take place. We hear, for example, about the 5-year plan. That's one of the major sort of moments in the history of Russia's collectivization. There are also very similar events in the history of communist China. So probably for those of us who are familiar with the history of China, we know that there's a very similar thing that's going to take place a little bit later, a couple decades later, in that country. But this occurs in Russia between 1928 and 1940. And yes, I see the comments there. It is a bit of a teaser for the book. We have 2 more little teasers for what's coming. So, for example, between 1936 and 1938 is a period in Soviet history that has become known to us as the Great Purge. And during this period, Stalin, as the leader of Russia, harshly hunts down and punishes his political enemies. So this is really a moment when Stalin solidifies his power, right, as absolute leader of Soviet Russia. Anyone who stands to compete with him for power is punished very severely during this period of time. We'll talk about this later in following weeks, but this is another event that is going to be represented in the book symbolically through the events that take place on an otherwise ordinary English farm. So some very serious history that is represented by these animals. Last, and this is also going to be very important for Orwell, is in 1938, when the Soviets signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. So this is a moment in history in which essentially the Soviets and the Nazis of Germany agree not to interfere with one another. So the Soviets essentially say, If you mind your business, we'll mind our business. For many people, this is a very dark moment in Soviet history, a real betrayal of the original ideals of the Russian Revolution, that they could possibly, agree to be in some kind of alliance with the Nazis. So again, I don't want to spoil the plot of the book, but this is something else to look forward to when we are reading the novel. I wanted to also talk a little bit about the characters before we actually get into the book, and to talk about who some of these characters represent. So we have here, as you can see, some illustrations. These illustrations actually come from a 1950s animated movie made as an adaptation of Animal Farm. So we can see here that there are three major human characters, a number of quite important characters who are pigs, and then some other animals, including horses and ravens. Now, there are additional animal characters. Someone knows something about the plot in the chat. There are additional animal characters who are less immediately important, but we will get to them later as well. But for now, I just wanted to focus on these quite major characters. So the human characters all symbolize in various ways quite major historical figures. So for example, we have Farmer Jones, who in many ways is an analog to Tsar Nicholas II, who was the last member of the Romanov dynasty, the last emperor of Russia before the revolution. We have Mr. Frederick, another human character, another farmer, actually, who in many ways symbolizes or represents Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, a figure who I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with in various ways. And last, we have Mr. Pilkington, who doesn't represent one particular individual, but does seem to represent various capitalist nations around the time of the Russian Revolution and World War II, in particular, the United States and the United Kingdom. So we have various different nations represented in this text. Now, to consider some of the pig characters. Pigs are very important to Animal Farm, and on many covers of Animal Farm, on various editions of the novel, you will see pigs represented in some way or another. Now, one important pig character who we're going to encounter quite early in the novel is Old Major. We see him right in chapter 1 when he gives a speech to the other animals. He's a very interesting character, I think, in this book. Now, he represents two different major historical figures. One is Karl Marx, and two is Vladimir Lenin. Now, Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, we could say, are the two major thinkers whose ideas drive the Russian Revolution and the subsequent history of Soviet Russia. Now, neither of them really, Karl Marx didn't really live to see the Russian Revolution, and Vladimir Lenin never really lived to see it in its fullest form. So he never really got to see it at the height of its power and geographical range. But nonetheless, their ideas were deeply central to what became the Soviet ideology. And so we're going to see these figures in different ways represented in the figure Old Major. Next, we have Snowball. Snowball is going to be an important character in many of the early chapters of the novel. Snowball is considered by most critics and scholars to be an analog or a symbolic representative of Leon Trotsky. Now, Leon Trotsky might not be as familiar to us as some other major figures in Soviet history, such as Vladimir Lenin or Joseph Stalin, but he's still a quite important figure. Leon Trotsky was one of the major figures of the early Russian Revolution. He was, in a sense, a close friend of Vladimir Lenin, a comrade of his, to use the Soviet term for this. In the early years of the Soviet Union, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin are going to be the two biggest figures in Soviet government. Ultimately, Trotsky and Stalin are going to have quite different visions for the Soviet Union. So in a sense, they are going to be rivals for dominant influence over the shape that the Soviet Union will take when it reaches its fullest form. Ultimately, as many of us probably know, Trotsky is not really the winner of his historical fight for influence with Joseph Stalin. So this figure is going to be represented in the character Snowball. Next, we have a figure we've already been talking about, and that's Joseph Stalin. So Joseph Stalin is going to be represented by the pig Napoleon, who we see. And I won't say a whole lot more about him because I want us to be excited and interested in him when we read the plot. But most of us are probably familiar with Stalin as a figure who's really dominant in many of the middle decades of the Soviet Union. He's the leader of the Soviet Union, for example, during World War II. And most importantly, he's the leader of the Soviet Union while Orwell is writing Animal Farm. So we'll keep an eye out for this character. Next, we have Squealer, the pig sitting behind Napoleon in that image. Squealer, I don't think really responds to or corresponds to any particular figure in Russian history, but he does seem to stand in for propaganda. Squealer's name even suggests that he has a relationship to speech, right? He's always squealing, talking. So we're going to have to keep an eye out for Squealer as we get to him. And last amongst the pigs, we have the 4 young pigs who represent, so most scholars believe, the original Soviets, or in other words, the Bolsheviks who are purged, or in other words, removed from the government during the Great Purge, which we talked about earlier. So that probably gives you some sense of how things are going to go for the 4 young pigs, but I won't say much more. Now, let's look at or talk about some reasons why we might want to read this book. Just so we have a sense of what is it that we're doing when we're reading Animal Farm. So one thing I want to mention is that Animal Farm is an immediate bestseller when it's published in 1945 in England. So from the bat, it was considered a pretty major work. So one thing is, we might be interested in knowing why, right at the end of World War II, so many people wanted to read this book. We also have a small fun fact there about the price that these original editions go for now. They're quite expensive if you want to get your hands on an early edition of Animal Farm. 2, many readers took to heart its warnings about the dire threat to democracy posed by totalitarianism, especially in a moment in history at which the US, the UK, and the USSR were in a military alliance. So in other words, Orwell really felt like he needed to write this book because this was a moment in which the US and the UK were quite friendly with Russia. In fact, they were allies with Soviet Russia against Nazi Germany. So it really seemed important to Orwell to make a warning about the threat that he felt that USSR posed to democratic nations like Britain and like the United States. Third, though the Soviet Union fell over 30 years ago, many contemporary readers and scholars believe that the lessons taught by Animal Farm continue to hold relevance. In other words, as much as the Soviet Union has disappeared, totalitarianism is very much still a part of the world today. And for that reason, I think that we still feel that there's something politically significant about what Orwell is doing here. Even if we don't, well, of course, Russia still is maybe a major figure in geopolitical sphere, even if the Soviets aren't. But nonetheless, I think that we all probably feel that the world has not yet quite shaken off totalitarianism yet. The last reason I want to mention that I think that we should read Animal Farm is that Orwell really gives us a very important warning. For example, he warns us about the dangers of propaganda, the manipulation of facts, and he also warns us about mob mentality, issues which have been amplified or made even more important in the contemporary world, and in particular by the internet. So probably we're familiar with the phrase mob mentality, but just to define this quickly, mob mentality, sometimes called herd mentality or pack mentality, describes how people can be influenced by their peers to adopt certain behaviors, follow trends, and or purchase items. So Orwell, in all of his books, is really interested in how it is that people sacrifice sometimes their individual will in order to follow others. Now, I also have here an important, I think, and very interesting quote by Julian Simons, who was actually a literary critic who was responding to Orwell during his lifetime. So Julian Simons wrote this in a review of Animal Farm when it came out, actually. So this gives us a sense of how people were responding to the text at the moment it was written. And Julian Simons writes, "In 100 years, perhaps, Animal Farm may be simply a fairy story. Today, it is a political satire with a good deal of point." So in a way, Julian Simons is here imagining, all the way in 1945 or so, a future in which maybe we won't need Animal Farm. But Julian Simons feels that we do need Animal Farm then, and I think many of us probably feel that we do need Animal Farm now. So we almost have to aspire to a day in which it could simply be a fairy story rather than a politically important work. Now, next, we're going to move into the reading sneak peek, which is where we're going to get a little glimpse of an excerpt of the text. Hopefully, this will serve as a bit of a teaser for everyone, or get us curious about what's to come as we read the early chapters of the text. So first, before I read out the reading sneak peek, I want to give just a little bit of context about where this passage is going to come into the text. And I don't think this is going to spoil anything, because this is right at the very beginning of the story, actually. So this quote is going to come from part in of the novel where the wisest and oldest pig on the farm, a boar named Old Major, who we've already discussed a little bit, tells the other farm animals about his vision for a future in which animals do not need to serve humans. So let's now take a look at that passage, and I'm going to read it aloud, and then we're going to talk about some of the key vocabulary used in this section. So here's the passage. "Man is the only creature that consumes without producing. He does not give milk. He does not lay eggs. He is too weak to pull the plow. He cannot run fast enough to catch rabbits. Yet he is Lord of all the animals. He sets them to work. He gives back to them the bare minimum that will prevent them from starving, and the rest he keeps for himself. Our labor tills the soil. Our dung fertilizes it, and yet there is not one of us that owns more than his bare skin. And remember, comrades, your resolution must never falter. No argument must lead you astray. Never listen when they tell you that man and the animals have a common interest, that the prosperity of the one is the prosperity of the others. It is all lies. Man serves the interest of no creature except himself." So now that we've read this passage, which I hope, again, is a little bit exciting to everyone in terms of what is going on in this novel where a pig is giving a speech that looks like that, let's also look at some of the vocabulary that might not be so familiar. So one word I want to define for you all is plow. This is a term that comes to us from farming or agriculture. A plow, as you can see in the picture there, that's a traditional plow, is a large farming tool that digs up the ground in lines, typically pulled by a horse or nowadays a machine. I'm sure there's a similar term for this kind of implement in Korean, but this is a plow. Second, let's think about this term bare minimum. This is a quite important phrase used in English quite often. The bare minimum is the smallest necessary number or amount of something required for a purpose. So for example, we might say, the lazy employees did the bare minimum to keep the hotel running, which would essentially mean they're not doing anything additional to make the hotel nice. They're doing just as much as they need to keep it operational. Next, let's look at the phrase common interest. So we often might say, for example, that two parties have a common interest when they would both benefit from the same action. So for example, we could say, the two nations had a common interest in combating climate change. So this is good for one party, but also good for another party. So we can imagine, what are the common interests between two individuals, between two companies, between two political parties, or between two nations? Last, I want to introduce our guided reading questions, which you guys can respond to on Band after you've read the first couple chapters of the novel. So I just wanted to read these to you all, and then to just sort of summarize a little bit to talk a little bit about why I'm asking these questions, about why I think that they're important questions to think about as you're reading the novel. So just as a reminder, before next week's session, you can read the assigned portion for the week, which is the first couple chapters of the book, to reflect on the guided questions, which I'm going to introduce next, and to share your answers with me through the Band community if you want to. This is, of course, optional, but I really do think that it can be useful to articulate your thoughts in writing, to share them with others, and to see what others have to say about the text as we move forward in it. So here are some of the guided questions for next week. Number 1, have your expectations for Animal Farm match the ones you had when you actually started reading it? If so, how? If not, what has been surprising about the novel? In other words, I know that many of us are familiar with Orwell. We know that he's this serious political writer. We also all know the name of the book, even if we haven't read it yet. So I want to know, once you've read the first couple chapters, is it what you were expecting? Or has something surprised you in the novel so far? The second question of our guided reading questions is this. The original title for the book was actually Animal Farm, a Fairy Story. Why do you think Orwell described it as a fairy story? How does Animal Farm resemble a fairy tale or a fable? Or how does it not resemble one? So maybe this is surprising to some of us, but this was actually, again, Orwell's original title, Animal Farm, a Fairy Story. The American publisher dropped a fairy story from the title, and most publishers after that followed from the American publisher in simply calling it Animal Farm. But I'm interested in why he wanted to call it a fairy story. So it's something for us to all think about. The second 2 questions are these. 3, what arguments does Old Major make in favor of the rebellion? Do you think his arguments, his answers are persuasive? Why or why not? In other words, I guess I'm curious to know whether or not you would be persuaded by Old Major's speech if you were an animal on a farm. Do you think that the complaints of the animals are justified? Do you think that they're right to want to kick the farmer off the farm? That's something to think about when we read the first chapter. And the last question I wanted to ask you all to think about as you read these first 4 chapters concerns one character who we're introduced to in the early chapters, and that is Molly, the horse. How would you describe Molly? And why does she have such a difficult time adjusting to life after the animals gain control of the farm? So this question is really asking you about one character, but I think that Molly, the horse, is a very interesting character who stands out among the other animals. So I wanted everyone just to pay a little bit of attention to Molly when she appears in the novel. So last, I wanted to ask everyone, before I leave for today, whether or not you have any final questions for me about anything you wanted me to clarify for now. And again, unfortunately, I know I won't probably be able to get to all of the questions that are asked, but those questions that I can't ask, I'd love for you guys to ask on Band, and I can hopefully look at some of those later. One question that has just popped up is, did the book come out as a cartoon? And so the answer actually is no. The book didn't come out as a cartoon, but it was quickly adapted into a cartoon. And it's kind of easy to see why, right? All of these animals lend themselves to a cartoon form very easily. And also, I think that makes this very difficult story easier for children to read or to view. Another question I have here is, who is your favorite character? That's a very good one. I really like or I'm very interested in Molly, the horse. That's why I asked a question about her. But there's also a goat character. I can't remember his name right now. You'll have to forgive me. But the goat is also very interesting because he's another figure who sort of stands apart from the other animals on the farm. Yes, thank you. Benjamin the goat. Thank you to Hyunyoung, who's responded in the chat. He's a character who really stands out because he, in a sense, doesn't, we might say, follow the pack mentality as much as the other animals on the farm do. So thank you for that great question. Do we have maybe a final question for now? Oh, I have a great final question here about Orwell's class status. So the question is, I heard that he was quite high class in the UK, but what are some factors he had that led to his skepticism of colonialism? That's a very good question. So as a member of the colonial elite in India, he was from a quite respectable, relatively high class family. Now, one important qualification there is as much as his family had high class, they didn't actually have much money. So they had class, but not a lot of money. And what that meant actually is that Orwell had to really compete to get scholarships to go to school, whereas other students could simply pay for it. And it also meant that he actually didn't attend college, which was very expensive. And scholarships were very difficult to get and very competitive. So his class position was a little bit complicated. Now, a factor that led to his skepticism of colonialism was his work as a policeman in India. When he had to enforce power in India, it really, I think, contradicted his sort of free-spirited nature. He's always been a very independent person. And so he really wasn't very well suited to be a police officer, and he was very unhappy there. But witnessing the various ways that Britain had to maintain power in India and Burma, including sometimes by violence, right? Including by physical punishment, imprisonment, and even occasionally executions, it really gave him a very negative view of what the British were doing in India. And that's part of why he resigned from the British imperial police. So I think that these are some of the factors that led to him being deeply skeptical of colonialism. Thank you for that really good question. Maybe we'll talk more about his time in the colonial police in a later week. Unfortunately, for now, I don't have further time for questions, but again, do please feel free to ask them on the band page. For now, however, I'm going to have to leave for today. Thank you all for joining me today and for talking about Animal Farm. I'm so excited to see that there are so many people interested in this, I think, very interesting and very important novel. So thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to chatting with you all in the future further, and to also getting to know you all on the band page. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of this info session. And again, looking forward to seeing you all in the future. Thank you all for the very kind comments in the chat. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. And goodbye for now.